So once again, we want to say good evening to everybody and welcome to our memorable Southern New England storms. Tonight, I'm Joe Deli Carpini, the Science and Operations Officer, and I'll be taking you through all of the storms. And along with me is Bryce Williams, one of our meteorologists and our social media team program leader. Bryce manages all of our social media at the office, so he'll be looking at your questions and comments and chiming in as we go along. So, Bryce, say hello.
Good evening, everyone.
Okay, making sure he's there.
I was
Okay,
trying to
so
find time to jump in and say hi before you started talking again, so thanks for giving me the
there you
intro.
go. But feel free to pop in with questions or comments, Bryce, as we go along. So this is again is memorable Southern New England storms, and this is going to cover storms from the early 1900s right through the 1960s. I think some of you may remember or at least be familiar with storms from the 50s and 60s, especially the tropical ones. So we're going to go through pretty much a calendar year by date and not necessarily by the year itself, but January through December with different events. So let's start off. This is a blizzard of January 13th to 14th of 1964. This was a large, slow-moving storm. Blizzard conditions all the way from the Mid-Atlantic states to southern New England. Locally in our area, Connecticut received about 7 to 15 inches of snow, but there were strong winds with drifts as high as 5 to 6 feet. 10 to 20 inches of snow in Massachusetts and wind gusts to 60 miles per hour. Reports of many cars being abandoned. Also, that was the situation in Rhode Island. And you could tell this was probably a bit more of an interior storm, or at least away from the immediate coast. 6 inches of snow on Block Island and 10 to 20 inches elsewhere. So there's a photo on the left that we were able to grab from the archives. That was the January 13th, 14th, 1964 blizzard. So a storm that might be a little more famous, this was in January of 1961, the JFK inaugural snowstorm. So this was the second of three major storms during that winter and struck on the eve of President John F. Kennedy's inauguration in D.C. and produced blizzard conditions here in southern New England. In our area, 1 to 2 feet of snow fell across much of the area with drifts up to 10 feet and travel nearly impossible. So this certainly was one of the higher end storms that we've had. And there was also significant coastal flooding with several homes destroyed in eastern Massachusetts, hundreds of evacuations, mainly in Hull, and severe erosion on the Cape Cod beaches. So you could see a newspaper clipping there on the lower right and a weather map of the storm there on the upper right. So that was the JFK inaugural snowstorm, 1961. That was kind of a famous one for the record books here on the East Coast. Something that may not be too exciting weather-wise, but it's kind of a neat statistic. February 1st, 1920 was a day of high pressure in New England. There was unusually strong high pressure, which was centered over Maine. We could see on the weather map here. And it set records for the highest pressure at many weather stations in New England. And in fact, the record of 31.06 inches in Hartford still stands today. These records stood at many other sites, as it says, for more than 60 years, but were broken on February 13th of 1981. And on the right, you can see a list of some of the stations here closer to home and some of the pressures recorded. Boston, 31.02, Nantucket, 30.92, Block Island, 30.94, and as we mentioned, Hartford was 31.06. So that was a day of record high pressure in New England. On February 4th, 1961, another blizzard. Low pressure formed near the Virginia coast, tracked southeast of New England, and that's usually a good storm track. Brought blizzard conditions to New York City and into southern New England. You can see some of the snowfall, specific snowfall on the left. The tops about 19 inches in Worcester, 18 in Providence, 17.4 in Central Park, 14 in Boston, Hartford, and even up into Portland, Maine, they received about 4 inches. But you could see certainly the heavier snow was focused even a little bit farther west across central New York and into northern Pennsylvania. But some pretty impressive wind gusts, too, as you can see. Blue Hill, 96 miles per hour, Block Island, 92 miles an hour, and 83 miles per hour at LaGuardia Airport in New York City. So that was February 4th of 1961.
There are no questions yet, but somebody did have a comment. Marie said about the one a few ones ago with the Kennedy inauguration. She said school got canceled and we could watch the inaugural.
Well,
So
there you
that was
go.
pretty
Great.
nice coincidence.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. Okay, so let's move on. Now, this was another famous snowstorm here on the East Coast. This is known as the Lindsay snowstorm, February 8th to 10th of 1969. This storm, as it reads here, formed on February 8th and became a pretty powerful winter storm as it reached the Northeast and stalled offshore. The New York City area actually bore the brunt of this storm with a lot of disruption, and the mayor of New York at the time, John Lindsay, was criticized for not responding adequately to the storm. A lot of the areas of the city were unplowed for over a week, and schools were closed for several days. So the New York City was really caught off guard from this storm. So hence, it was known as the Lindsay snowstorm. And for our area, really 1 to 2 feet of snow for much of the area. It was the most devastating snowstorm in several years. As you can see, tens of thousands without power. Cars were abandoned. Logan Airport in Boston closed for more than a day, and schools and businesses were closed for several days. So that was a long-lasting storm, February 8th to 10th of 1969. Hey, Hayden, I'm calling you Bryce. Any comments on that one? There may be some folks who remember that.
None yet.
Okay. Okay, well, that was the Lindsay storm. In 1940, this was another famous East Coast storm, February 14th, the Valentine's Day blizzard. And this was uh, prior to the newer Valentine's Day blizzard that occurred here in 2015. But you could see this was a fairly decent storm for our area. It began in the afternoon and caused havoc for that evening's commute. Cars were stalled out in the middle of the streets and abandoned, making snow plowing impossible. And I think that's a theme we've heard of here several times with some surprise storms. The plows can't get out and do their work. Some travelers were stranded for days, and there was actually an ice show in Boston that evening, and people were in attendance there. It took place, and then as they came out, it was snowing so hard they found out that their trains had been canceled going home, so they were stuck and had to actually stay at the arena that night or find a hotel in Boston. So some of the snowfall totals there, ranging from at our climate sites, 15 at Blue Hill, 14 Boston, 12.5 Providence, 10 inches in Hartford, and 8 in Worcester. And those photos on the left are courtesy of the New England Historical Society. That is the February 14th, 1940 Valentine's Day blizzard. On February 19th to 1927, this was the schooner Nancy, which ran aground on Nantasket Beach. It was anchored at Boston Light to ride out an expected storm, and the storm did hit the next day with winds of 70 miles per hour, but it ended up dragging the vessel out of Boston Harbor. As you can see here, the captain ordered an extra sail set so she would clear the rocks. The maneuver had worked, but then the schooner headed toward shore and ran aground on Nantasket Beach in Hull. So it grounded during unusually high tide and remained stuck in the sand, as you can see in the photo, the middle photo there. It quickly became a tourist attraction and drew record crowds. You can see folks lining up to kind of take a look at it. It eventually fell into disrepair during the Great Depression and was eventually dismantled for firewood. But this was a pretty strong coastal storm that caused the schooner Nancy to run aground on Nantasket Beach. Now we're moving on. This is the 100-hour snowstorm, February of 1969. There may be some folks who remember this one. The snow began on February 23rd, and it didn't come to an end until 5 days later. This was a slow-moving coastal storm that brought as much as 2 to 3 feet of snow, even nearly 39 inches of snow at Blue Hill Observatory. As you would expect, schools and businesses were closed, roads were impassable, and the storm was responsible for over 40 fatalities. But you can see really the northern New England kind of bore the brunt of this storm, as the shading in the red here, with over 30 to almost 50 inches of snow. But here in eastern Massachusetts and even into central Mass and northern Rhode Island, snowfall totals exceeded 2 feet in many areas. So this was a long-lasting 100-hour snowstorm of February 1969. And I'm curious if anyone out there remembers this one. Might have a few people who do.
Haven't got a comment on this one specifically yet. Oh wait, actually no, I do see one. No school for days in February 1969 with all the snow. Makes sense.
Yep.
And then we had a question. Oh, hold on. 100-hour storm originally forecast to be a cold rain along the coast. apparently.
Yeah, I believe that is true. So as I should have mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing a more in-depth top 10 series of storms. So I would think we would definitely include this one. So we'll take a look at the forecasting from that. But I believe that is the case. It was supposed to be rain, just a cold rain, and that didn't happen. A little more in the way of snow. So good memory there. Yep.
Martin said 44 inches of snow where I live in Old Town, Maine.
44. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
I
Not
can't even
bad.
imagine that.
All
Can't
right.
even imagine.
Yeah,
All
too
right, that's
much.
all the questions we got
Okay.
about this storm.
All right. So moving the last day of February 28th, 1952. This was an intense nor'easter that strengthened on the 27th and impacted portions of this was southeast Massachusetts through the 28th. It hit Cape Cod the hardest. We had winds of 70 to 80 miles per hour and snowfall of 12 to 20 inches, creating 12-foot drifts. And this storm reported that 80% of Cape Cod lost power, and some motorists were stranded on area roadways. So it made so much headline news across the country. Papers like the Chicago Times reported on the storm. So this was February 28th of 1952, a pretty compact storm that mainly affected southeast Massachusetts. So going into March, this was the blizzard of March 2nd to the 5th of 1960. This storm produced blizzard conditions in eastern Massachusetts. You can see snowfall totals of really over 2 feet across much of central eastern Massachusetts and from northeast Connecticut into northern Rhode Island. Boston received a record-breaking 19.8 inches of snow, that was the record back in 1960. Near hurricane force winds along both coasts, and snow drifts as high as 5 to 10 feet in some locations. So that was the blizzard of March 2nd to 5th, 1960. And you could even see out on Nantucket, they ended up with, it looks like 31 inches of snow from this storm. So quite a pretty big snowstorm for the eastern part of southern New England.
And just a couple of questions and comments that
Sure.
have rolled in about a couple in the past. Somebody, I'm guessing this was the 100-hour storm. Somebody was talking about saying wasn't warm. It didn't pull in warm air off the ocean with that long duration. I guess it wasn't
No.
that was late in the winter, right?
Correct.
So
Yeah. So later in the winter, the water temperatures are too cold. So you typically don't see that kind of changeover. Plus, the track of the storm, it was offshore and stalled. So you're not really going to pull in a lot of mild air that way. So yeah, these later season storms, the ocean water doesn't come into as much of an effect as it does earlier in the season. It's like this one from March of 1960. It's easterly winds, but it's cold.
Okay. And then Ronald's just noticed a trend. He said, seeing a trend in our most powerful storms in the month of February.
Yeah, climatologically, that's the peak of our major winter storm. So that's always kind of been the case. So that's when our air temperatures are really the coldest. It takes a few weeks past the winter solstice at the end of December to reach our kind of minimum temperatures for the year. So that normally occurs the latter part of January and early February. Plus, as I mentioned, the ocean temperatures are cold, so you don't have the warming from the ocean that time of year. So yeah, usually our most intense storms are in that late January, February timeframe. The cold air, coming across the land. The Gulf Stream is still offshore. It's always warm, and that's a source of energy, despite the rest of the ocean being fairly cold. So that's a good observation, and that is correct. We do have our strongest storms during that part of the year.
And then last question from Jason, which this is more general, but have the methods of measuring snow changed from the early time periods back then to now? And we would think that would
yeah, and that could have led to somewhat inflated totals. They used to measure hourly, and then it was measured 3 hourly, and today it's measured every 6 hours. So if you measure every hour, and that's why we don't recommend doing that, you'll actually lead to more inflated totals because the snow hasn't settled properly. So yeah, there's probably to some degree those amounts were a little bit higher than if we had the same storm today and measured it. But that's how that was the standard back then, especially the early part of the 1900s. By the I believe by the 60s, it wasn't done every hour anymore. But I'd have to check on that. But certainly the early part of the 1900s, yes, it was almost every hour, which was too much. So good point. All right, so we have the snow falls, and then the snow has to melt. So I think many remember the Great New England Flood of 1936, at least from the history books. That winter featured a series of heavy snowfalls, extended periods of cold weather. So there was quite a bit of ice in some of the rivers, the Connecticut River in particular. And then for 2 weeks beginning in mid-March, we had melting snow and heavy rain, causing the worst floods in New England history. And those records are even still stand today for many locations. The frozen rivers produced these blocks of ice, as seen here, as large as automobiles, and that all produced incredible damage as the ice moved downstream. And it was this Great New England Flood of 1936 that prompted the Army Corps of Engineers to implement I would call flood mitigation, not flood control, but things like dams and other things to help minimize flooding along the rivers. So a lot of the dams went in and reservoir control, things like that, to kind of prevent widespread flooding like this from occurring again. And for the most part, it's worked pretty well. So that was the Great New England Flood, 1936. So another winter storm. This was March 18th of 1956. There were 3 snowstorms that affected southern New England in a 10-day period. This one was the most significant, with upwards of 20 inches falling throughout much of the Northeast, as you can see here on the map. Blue Hill wins the top prize, 19.5 inches. Providence almost 15, Hartford 14, and Boston a little over 13. But even almost a foot of snow down in New York City, 11 in Bridgeport, and 7 in Worcester. So this certainly was during that string of storms in March of 1956. This was the most significant one. Something not directly related as a storm, but kind of a neat piece of weather trivia. April 1st of 1960 was the launch of the first weather satellite, known as TIROS-1. It was an immediate success, actually, by sending photographs down to Earth and putting us kind of into the era of using satellite imagery to analyze storms. It had a lifetime of just 2.5 months, but transmitted over 19,000 usable photos showing Earth's cloud formation. So it was the first venture into using satellites to kind of analyze the weather. So that was back on April 1st, 1960. On May 20th, 1963, now we're getting into severe weather season, 4 tornadoes struck Massachusetts in one day, as you can see them listed here. All were rated as F2 tornadoes, damage primarily to barns and some houses, but thankfully no injuries or fatalities. So as you can see, these were largely out in western and central Massachusetts, touching down during the afternoon with, for the most part, 2 of them were fairly short in length, but this one east of the Quabbin Reservoir, almost 4 miles long, and this other one out a little bit north of West Boylston is about 1.5 miles long. So this was in May 20th of 1963, 4 tornadoes in one day. Another tornado, this was May 24th of 1962, F3 tornado in Connecticut, formed over Middlebury at about 5:30 p.m. and moved to the Bunker Hill section of Waterbury, causing considerable damage. And then moving to the east-northeast kind of erratically, it demolished a residential area and then moved on to the industrial sections of Waterville on the northern outskirts of Waterbury. So at just before 6 p.m., then it crossed into Southington, and that was the end of the tornado's 12-mile path where it lifted, but debris was spread as far east as Manchester. So seeing the impacts here, one account had losses included 70 structures of all types razed, 175 heavily damaged, and about 600 moderately destroyed. But another account puts over 200 buildings, including 46 homes being destroyed and over 600 buildings damaged. So obviously utilities were disrupted and hundreds of trees were down. So there was 1 fatality and about 50 people injured in total. And back in 1962, the damage was estimated at $4 million. So that was in Connecticut, the F3 tornado from about Middlebury over into Southington. Now, of course, no look at the 50s would be complete without the Worcester tornado. This was June 9th of 1953. The tornado touched down in Petersham at 4:25 and stayed on the ground for 84 minutes. The peak intensity was in Holden, Worcester, and Shrewsbury, and this was an F4, winds of 207 to 260 miles per hour, which produced devastating damage. And a second tornado rated as F3 touched down near Millbury, Mass. About an hour later, resulting in 17 injuries. You can see some of the imagery here. This was actually a photo taken from Shrewsbury of the Worcester tornado. Damage at Assumption College. Some hail in Rutland, Mass. is listed here. And you can see the two tracks of the tornadoes that day, the Worcester tornado being the red line and the Millbury tornado being the orange line. And this was fairly typical setup for a big severe weather day, and similar to that of June 1st, 2011, which also produced a long-lived EF3 tornado from Springfield on east. You have a warm front moving north early in the day, a little bit of a wind shift line trough, surface trough coming across in the afternoon with tropical moisture in the area. So kind of a classic setup, but a rare setup, probably a once in 50 to 60 year event we were looking at here with the Worcester tornado. So that was June 9th of 1953. And just to show a few more images from that, the Boston Globe, obviously it made headlines that day. The tornado kills 100, 700 injured in the central part of the state. Worcester hardest hit. And then some photos we were able to, I would say, borrow from the Worcester Telegram, some of the damage. You can see just homes completely leveled there on the right, significant damage to buildings. This was very similar to the damage we saw in Springfield and other areas, and to Munson and Brimfield in June 1st, 2011. So very similar to that. Internally, we found some information on what happened that day. At the Boston Weather Bureau, they knew the history of the weather system. It had produced tornadoes in Michigan the day before with a pretty widespread severe weather outbreak. And they knew there was kind of a potential for tornado development in Massachusetts. One of the meteorologists, Al Flahive, and the other staff met at 10 a.m. to discuss the mention of tornado for the next issuance, but decided against it because it would have been alarming. So in those days, you really didn't use the word tornado too much because it would incite kind of panic. But they opted to include the first ever severe thunderstorm forecast wording in New England at 11:30 a.m. And there's the actual forecast there. Windy, partly cloudy, hot and humid with thunderstorms, some locally severe developing this afternoon. So, for 1953, certainly not a bad forecast. And this is a look at a radar image taken of the Worcester tornado at about 4:55 p.m. This was from MIT's radar in Lexington, and you can clearly see the hook echo signature here when the storm was over Holden, Mass. And this is taken from the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. And also we have a photograph of the tornado at the same time when it was in Holden from Tom Grzoulis. This, again, kind of looks very similar. It's dark, but it looks very similar to the Springfield tornado in June of 2011. And again, here's a larger photo, again, the one we showed earlier, the tornado in Shrewsbury on 5:22 p.m. So there's a phone call made after 5 p.m. from Blue Hill to the Boston Weather Bureau. Observer John Conover reported debris falling out of the sky. And you can see this quote there and saying, "I'm afraid there's been a bad tornado somewhere." The forecaster Draybird agreed and issued the first ever tornado warning in New England, mentioning caution advised on severe thunderstorms with isolated tornado activity in the Boston area between 6 and 8 p.m. this evening. That was sent by teletype, and of course by then it was pretty much done, but debris falling out of the sky at Blue Hill from the Worcester tornado. And here's a look again at the tornadoes that day. There was also a tornado up in New Hampshire, but you can see the main Worcester tornado here, and then the secondary one here, Sutton into northern Mansfield, where it finally ended up at about 5:30 p.m. So the final statistics, it was F4 damage on the ground, 84 minutes. Path length was 46 miles, the width up to a mile in spots. That's like reminiscent of a Midwest tornado with a length and width of that. 94 fatalities, nearly 1,300 injuries, and about 4,000 buildings destroyed. And debris was found in the Boston area and on Cape Cod. In fact, a frozen mattress was found in Massachusetts Bay near Weymouth, and books and clothing were found at Blue Hill and on the outer part of Cape Cod from Provincetown through Eastham down to Chatham. So, Bryce, any comments on that, Worcester tornado?
Somebody just said Howard Bluestein was 8 years old at the time. It inspired him to dedicate his life to research. His mom warned that tornadoes eat little boys.
I do believe that is correct. I have read that as well. So It began a great career of someone who studied severe weather and tornadoes and still does today out at OU. So thank you. All right. Moving on, we're into July. Not, related to weather, the sinking of the Andrea Doria. This is obviously one of the more well-known maritime disasters. It occurred on the night of July 25th, 1956, in dense fog, well south of Nantucket. It was struck by the MS Stockholm. The ship did stay afloat for over 11 hours after the collision, so most of the people were rescued and survived, but 46 people died as a direct consequence of the collision. The evacuated ship capsized and sank the following morning, and it still lies there today. That's southeast of Nantucket where the star is. So that's the sinking of the Andrea Doria in dense fog off Nantucket in July of 1956. This is one we dug up earlier this year. This is the Rehoboth tornado, July 31st, 1927. This was kind of an interesting case. It was witnessed by many people on their way to attend Sunday evening church service. It was a fairly small track, as you can see here. We've kind of overlaid the track on a Google map. But the roof of an ice house was ripped off and flew 300 feet before landing on a car. Immediately after, a large tree crashed through a car roof. It killed the driver and injured the rest. The post office and the store beside the ice were twisted off their foundations. You can see quite a bit of damage. Trees, electric poles, wires were downed on roads throughout the area, making them impassable. And this same storm actually produced another brief tornado touchdown in North Duxbury, which caused some additional damage. But this was July 31st of 1927 in Rehoboth, the Rehoboth tornado. Okay, now we're going to move on to probably the tropical portion of our series, getting to the 50s here. August 11th to 12th, Hurricane Connie. Now, although Hurricane Connie didn't make landfall in New England, you can see here by the black line, rainfall totals of 4 to 8 inches kind of primed the pump for disastrous flooding that would occur with Hurricane Diane about a week later, and we'll get to Diane in a minute. But certainly the flooding was worse to the south of our region, especially down across New York City to the mid-Atlantic. This photo on the left from the AP is flooding in the New York City area, but did still produce some decent rainfall amounts in western part of New England, as you can see here, on the order of about 5 to 7 inches, with a maximum of over 13 inches at Fort Schuyler in the Bronx, New York. So Connie not directly impacting us with a lot of damage, but set the stage for what was to come with Hurricane Diane. And speaking of Hurricane Diane, that was August 15th of 1955. And you can see really prolific rainfall totals here. The track of Diane had moved inland, but then reemerged over Long Island and tracked south of New England from August 15th to 19th. Peaked as a Category 2 hurricane just before it made landfall in North Carolina. And the all-time 24-hour rainfall total in Westfield, 18.15 inches, and that still stands today as the state record for Massachusetts 24-hour rainfall. But you can see a very widespread band of 10-plus inch rainfall, northern Connecticut across pretty much the Mass Pike, heading over into the Boston area. Nearly 17 inches in Torrington, Connecticut, 16 inches in Barkhamsted, about 8.5 inches in Greenville, Rhode Island. There were 90 fatalities in the region, including 77 in Connecticut, 12 in Massachusetts, and 1 in Rhode Island. So you can see some of the flood damage here in Winsted, Connecticut, occurring because of Hurricane Diane. So that was August of 1955. Going back, offshore hurricane of 1924, this was August 26th. You can see the track here. It started out in the Atlantic went north of the Bahamas, and it kind of paralleled the East Coast, remaining offshore, but still bringing some devastating impacts to our region. First heavy rainfall in New Bedford at 7 inches, even in the Boston, almost 4.4 inches. Residents on Cape Cod and the islands considered damage worse than the 38 hurricane. After the hurricane, obviously that occurred later, but to them the damage would end up being worse. Large waves, including one up to 100 feet, crossed over the White Star ship Arabic off Nantucket Shoals as the storm passed, and it ended up limping into New York Harbor. Storm surge caused some flooding in North Carolina where 2 people drowned. A lighthouse keeper down there reported waves swept over the top of the lighthouse at 70 feet above the water, washed boats away, and damaged the tower. And there was damage to beachfront cottages in Little Compton, Rhode Island. So you can see some of the damage here. Peak gusts of Block Island of 78 miles per hour, Cape Hatteras 74, 72 in Atlantic City and Cape Henry in Virginia. So that was the offshore hurricane, August 26th of 1924. Normally, with a track like that, we would just expect some heavy rain and that's it. But this one also produced some wind. Okay, back to the 50s now. Hurricane Carol on August 31st. Carol made landfall near Old Saybrook as a Category 3 hurricane. As you can see, sustained winds 80 to 100 miles per hour pummeled eastern Connecticut, all of Rhode Island, and much of eastern Massachusetts. Trees, power lines, and crops suffered a lot of destruction. Block Island recorded the strongest wind gust ever recorded, 135 miles per hour. The storm surge caused extensive coastal flooding across Connecticut, Rhode Island, and south coastal Massachusetts. And the largest surge occurred within Narragansett Bay in New Bedford Harbor with over 14 feet of storm surge, which is something we haven't seen since. So quite a bit of storm surge from a Category 3 hurricane. Hurricane Carol, August 31st of 1954. On September 11th of 1954, Hurricane Edna, again less than 2 weeks after Hurricane Carol, made landfall on Martha's Vineyard and the Cape as a Category 2 hurricane. Sustained winds of 75 to 95 miles per hour hit coastal Rhode Island and eastern Massachusetts. Gusts of 100 to 120 miles per hour across the Cape and the islands. And a 6+ foot storm surge resulted in serious flooding across the Cape and the islands. So a few pictures here from Hurricane Edna in September of 1954. Definitely the 50s and 60s were kind of the most frequent time. I wouldn't say the golden age, but certainly more frequent hurricanes and tropical activity than we've seen in a long time. In 1950, September 11th to 12th, Hurricane Dog was a Category 4 storm that remained offshore. Now, for those who go back in history, during the 50 to 52 seasons, the Atlantic hurricanes were named using the Joint Army and Navy phonetic alphabet. So there were no male or female names. They were just using the phonetic alphabet. So it was Hurricane Dog. It produced coastal flooding in Rhode Island, even though it stayed offshore. Capsized or damaged boats, about at least 15 vessels in Marblehead. Powerful wind gusts on the Cape and Nantucket, resulting in widespread power outages. And the highest rainfall stayed closer to the center near Nantucket, about 4 to 5 inches. But from folks who have been around a while, they usually mention Hurricane Dog causing some damage across southeast New England. That was September of 1950. Now, one that some folks may remember a little more recent was Hurricane Donna, September 12th of 1960. The track was through onto the Carolinas and then paralleled the coast and made another landfall into Connecticut. Produced significant wind damage across the region, 4 to 6 inches of rain inland to the west of the track and 2 to 4 inches to the east. Tides running 8 to 9 feet above normal in Providence, but it occurred before high tide, fortunately, so flooding was minimal. And as you can see here, tracked from the Connecticut-Rhode Island border into pretty close to Lowell, Massachusetts, then to southern New Hampshire and Maine. Some of the peak wind gusts, Blue Hill Observatory, 140 miles per hour. Block Island, 130. Point Judith, Rhode Island, 100. Providence, TF Green, 81 miles per hour. And Boston at Logan Airport, 79 miles per hour. So that was Hurricane Donna in September of 1960. Going back at 1944, September 15th, the Great Atlantic Hurricane. This made landfall across Long Island and then Point Judith, Rhode Island, as a Category 2 hurricane with sustained winds of 100 to 105 miles per hour. And that produced a large swath of wind damage across southeast Massachusetts and Rhode Island with heavy rain and flooding. Devastating impact to the marine community, 70-foot waves offshore and nearly 400 deaths at sea. And a large impact on World War II shipping. U.S. Navy destroyer and minesweeper were sunk, as well as 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters. So that was the Great Atlantic Hurricane, 1944. That was September 15th. And, of course, the Great New England Hurricane of 38, also known as the Long Island Express, or in some cases the big one. That was September 21st. This was the most, I would say, one of the most, if not the most destructive, powerful storms to ever strike southern New England. It made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane. It roared up the coast at speeds of 50 to 60 miles per hour, moving across Long Island and then into Connecticut. Unfortunately, it arrived at high tide on the day of the fall equinox, which created an extraordinarily high and deadly storm surge. Downtown Providence was submerged under 20 feet of water. Hurricane-force winds felt throughout all of New England, gusts to 186 miles per hour at the Blue Hill Observatory, and the storm was responsible for over 600 deaths, most across coastal Rhode Island, due to storm surge. And you can see the headline there from the Sun: Muscomacut wiped out, Nabotry Point gone, scores missing, 50 dead. So just a devastating impact. That's the hurricane of 38. You can see another close-up of the Westerly Sun headline the next day. And some of the damage photos from our archives. You can see this had it all. The wind, the storm surge, the heavy rain and flooding. This really featured all the hazards of a hurricane. So that was the Great Hurricane, New England Hurricane, 1938. So certainly one of the most devastating storms to affect our region. In 1961, we had Hurricane Esther. This was actually the first large tropical cyclone to be discovered by satellite imagery. We mentioned TIROS 1. This was by TIROS 3, as you can see in the satellite picture down here. It did a little bit of a loop offshore, was moving offshore, paralleled the coast, did a loop, and then came pretty close to Nantucket and the Outer Cape. It's produced a storm surge of 4 to 6 feet with severe beach erosion and some coastal roads washed out. Many downed trees and power outages, and it made landfall as a tropical storm, not a hurricane, while it was meandering offshore at weekend. You can see some of the rainfall here in inches, pretty impressive. In the yellow, that's anywhere of 6 inches plus across eastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island and southeast Connecticut. So that was Hurricane Esther. Peak wind gust 97 miles per hour at the Nantucket Lightship, 83 on Block Island, and 70 at Chatham. On October 25th, 1925, there was a tornado in Woburn, Massachusetts. This skipped east across Woburn, damaging about 75 buildings. One man was killed by a chimney brick as he ran for cover. And it is likely the tornado formed along a warm front that afternoon. If you can kind of see the weather map here, maybe a little hard to see, but where my cursor is, that's showing a warm front from that morning. Moved north during the day, and as I showed with the Worcester tornado, once the warm front lifts north, you get into that hot and humid air, and sometimes conditions can become favorable for isolated tornadoes. But this was one that struck Woburn, and there's the headline from the Boston Globe. 75 buildings damaged as tornado sweeps over Woburn. That was back in October 25th of 1925. Okay, now we're getting back into the cooler weather season. So November 11th to 12th of 1968, coastal storm produced high winds and early season snows from Georgia all the way up to Maine, and you can see the track of the storm. Monday, November 11th, it's over the Gulf Coast. By the 12th, it's sitting over the Carolinas, and then by the 13th, it's heading pretty much north of into the Gulf of Maine. Winds reached 90 miles per hour in Massachusetts. The lowest pressure got down to 984 millibars, which is pretty respectable for a winter storm. You can see some of the snowfall totals there. 1 inch in Atlanta, Georgia, 3 inches in Baltimore, and then closer to home, almost 4.5 inches there in Hartford, 7 inches in Worcester, 4 inches in Manchester, New Hampshire, and 6 inches in Portland, Maine. So that was November 11th to 12th of 1968. On November 15th of 1967, tell me if you've heard this one before it happened again in the 2000s. This was an early season snow with gridlock in the Boston area. Produced little to no snow in the Connecticut Valley, but a quick 4 to 8 inches in Rhode Island and central and eastern Massachusetts, locally around a foot in the Merrimack Valley. Boston received 2.2 inches, which was the most so early in the season since 1894, but happened to coincide with the evening rush hour. So as you can see here from the Boston Globe photo, unprepared drivers resulted in stalled cars, blocked traffic. Thousands of commuters were stranded in Boston. Others, going to the suburbs didn't arrive at home till well past midnight, and some students were stuck at school overnight. So Again, that happened in the early 2000s. Snow falls at just the right time and catches people by surprise, and this is the result. So that was November 15th of 1967.
I've got a lot of questions that have come in the last
Okay.
5 minutes.
Do you want to go ahead and go through them?
Yeah.
Sure.
If you want to go ahead and roll through them. So somebody just mentioned that Carol was one of the few hurricanes that kept its shape as it made landfall in New England, and many people recall being in a distinct calm eye.
Yeah, it tends to be unusual because the hurricanes, as they come up this far north, start to transition into a regular kind of low pressure system or almost like a nor'easter. So usually all the rain lifts onto the northern edge of the circulation and there's very little behind what was the eye. But in that case, yeah, that's correct. It did maintain its kind of tropical status as it moved through the area. Others that have done that more recently would be, Gloria would be an example of that too, having an eye as it crossed the region.
Somebody wants to know, there was 5 tropical cyclone landfalls in the 1954, 1955 time frame. Is there a hypothesis to explain this anomaly?
I would say just coincidence, believe it or not.
I don't think there's
yeah,
rhyme or reason.
no, it just really depends on the weather pattern, a week or so ahead of the storm as it's forming, as to where it's going to go. This year, look at this year, everything's gone into the Gulf of Mexico for the most part, not so much on the East Coast. So it's almost a roll of the dice. You can have an active season and have almost virtually no landfalls. You can have a very much below active season and have one landfall. So look at 1992, Hurricane Andrew. That was the only landfall of that season. So, and even Hurricane Bob was one landfall. So, yeah, it's really just kind of a roll of the dice as to whether or not we see, successive landfalls or none at all. That just happened to be a pretty active period.
David had an anecdote about Carol also. He said, I was living in Melrose, and I believe that Carol's eye passed right over our house, and though we suffered no damage, I can still envision a couple of large trees in our neighbor's yard falling victim to the winds. So
yeah, that's certainly possible. I believe it. That's neat. Not everybody gets to get through the eye of a hurricane, especially up here.
I remember something that resembled a tornado in Manchester by the Sea in the summer of 1951-52. Do you know anything about that?
We probably would have to look it up. It's probably in the archive somewhere. Oh, I'm sorry, Bryce, we lost you there.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just saying, I'm guessing you don't know off the top of your head, but we could look it up.
Yep.
And if you want to send Joe an email, just we could follow up on that.
Yeah, go right ahead. Write me a note, and I can dig up through the archives. I'm sure we have something on that.
Brian wants to know, how did forecasting work before satellite was available? Back in this, when we get back, farther back we get, the less we had available.
Yeah, that really was just done by, weather map. Things move west to east or south to north, and you track the daily weather map and kind of used old rules of thumb. The barometer falling, probably unsettled weather's on the way. The wind shifts to the west and the barometer rises. Okay, the fair weather's on the way. It was very generalized for the most part. And there was no real computer technology back then to help forecast, no computer models. So really just a lot of rules of thumb and following weather maps were the basic ways to forecast.
Ronald says, has anyone created a model of what the 1938 hurricane looked like in graphics? Isn't that what Bill Letham's?
Yes, actually, one of our meteorologists, Bill Letham, is actually modeling that as part of a study. So what we will do, he's still working on it. It's going to be a while before it's done, but when he has some output from it, we actually could show that. Maybe we'll include that in our top 10 series, Bryce. That would be fun to do because he's actually trying to recreate the rainfall and the winds, the kind of the wind field from it. So, yeah, it's actually being done at our office. So that's something we can certainly show in a future webinar.
Esther's graphic indicates the storm was at I'm guessing Category 5 off of Delaware. Was that the case? Or is that just a miss?
I don't believe Esther. I thought Esther was before. Let's see. We'll have to look into that. Yeah, my slides aren't advancing backwards, so I can't go back to look at it. Um,
No,
but yeah,
not sure about that one. Technical difficulties. And I think that is it. Oh, hold on. Yeah, that's it.
okay. Well, you know what I'll do is we'll shoot back to Esther at the end just to double check on that. So we're getting into late November now. So this is 1950, the Great Easterly Gale, and this was a fairly historic storm for especially the Ohio Valley and even into New England. There was extensive wind damage from North Carolina into Ohio and New Hampshire, severe tidal flooding in Connecticut. And in fact, it was so bad that plows were needed to remove sand from coastal roads. You can see some of the flooding here at LaGuardia Airport in New York. Some of the sustained winds and wind gusts, pretty impressive. 110 in Concord, 108 at Newark, even 90 in Syracuse, 80 miles per hour in Boston. And the sustained winds were pretty impressive, nearly hurricane force across parts of the area. And talking about the snow, this was back across the Ohio Valley, as I mentioned. They had blizzard conditions, 10 to 30 inches of snow. Arctic air actually came up from the south from this storm and wrapped around it. You can see there Pittsburgh was 9 degrees with blizzard conditions and a total of 30 and a half inches of snow. And meanwhile, Buffalo, to the north, had rain and temps in the 50s from mild air on the northern side of the storm. So a very unusual storm. And also a record Arctic outbreak for November. Atlanta, Georgia fell to 3 above zero, and Nashville, Tennessee, 1 below zero. So this was a storm that really kind of got wrapped up, had a lot of energy, and kind of just stalled out over western Pennsylvania, western New York, and brought heavy snow to that area. So that was November 25 to 26 of 1950. Back in 1921, there was a pretty destructive ice storm here in southern New England, November 27th to 28th. Ice was more than 3 inches thick in some places. Streets were impassable. You can see this picture here, courtesy of the Bancroft Library. Phone lines were knocked down, so communication was knocked out, and damage between $15 and $20 million. That's back in 1921. So that's quite a bit of damage. That was kind of an early season ice storm in November of 1921. In December of 1960, winter storm from the 10th to the 12th. This had major impacts from the mid-Atlantic into New England, with blizzard conditions across much of the region. Airports closed, schools and businesses closed. Even the New York Stock Exchange opened an hour late, marking the first delayed opening in over 25 years. And there was extensive drifting of snow, left communities isolated, unable to receive deliveries of food and heating fuel. You can see some of the snow totals: 21 inches in Newark, 15 in Portland, 15 in Philly, just about, and about 13 inches in Hartford and Boston, with 94 mile per hour winds on Block Island and 85 mile per hour winds on Nantucket. So that was December 10th to 12th of 1960. And Christmas Eve, 1966, the Christmas Eve storm. So for many of the baby boomers in the Northeast, many of them remember this one. It was in full swing by nightfall, forcing many religious and holiday services to be canceled. But the worst of the storm didn't last too long, and actually the snow ended overnight and was done by Christmas morning. But kind of a quick hitter. The heaviest snowfall actually fell to the west of our area, the Poconos, up into the Catskills of New York and into northern Vermont and New York. 7 inches in Hartford, 6 inches in Worcester and at the Blue Hill Observatory, just under 6 at Boston, and a little over an inch in Providence. So that was Christmas Eve of 1966. And finally, I think we'll wrap it up. This is I believe, our last one. December 30th of 1917, coldest high temperatures on record for Boston and Hartford. Boston only reached a high of 2 degrees, and it was only 1 below in Hartford, and those still stand as the coldest high temperatures on record for both cities. Providence was close. It had a high of 2 degrees, and that fell shy of the record of 1 degree set back in February 5th, 1918. And likewise, Worcester fell just shy of its record. The high of -1 just missed the record of -2 set on January 8th of 1968. So that was a cold end to 1917. So that will do it. Bryce, are there any other comments? And in the meantime, I can kind of go back to
the only one I see was, someone said, would you say the tracks of Carol and Edna indicate the same pattern?
Well, now I can go back. Let's see. Well, there's Edna. So that was the question on that. Was it a category 5, first of all?
Oh no, that was for
Carol?
another E one. What was the other E? There's another E one. Maybe I think it was. Is that the only E?
Yeah.
Is there E? Okay, that must have been Edna.
Yes. Yeah.
Somebody
Edna.
thought that it must have been a Cat 5 by Delaware. But it's
It's listed here, I
no,
believe,
there's nothing.
category 3. Yeah. He was listed as category 3 and made landfall here as a
Questionable.
category 2.
And then, so it was this one and Carol that Ronald was asking if that would indicate, because they have similar
Similar
methods or similar
tracks.
tracks.
Yeah, Carroll was a little closer to the coast, as you can see as I flip between. Edna was more offshore. But a lot of the storms in the Bahamas, as you can see there, come up into our neck of the woods. That's why our old rule of thumb, if you go to Tropical 101, says anything with the name of the Bahamas is our business. And that's why, look, here in the Bahamas, shoots north. And Carroll, in the Bahamas, shoots north. Not necessarily the same track, but parallel to the coast and made landfall. Both made landfall in southern New England.
Joe said actually it was Esther he was talking about.
Oh, Esther. Okay. Let's see if we can get did I pass that? There we go. Okay. Yeah, I believe that's a 4. There's 2 shades of purple. It's a
Oh
3
yeah, they're
here,
very similar.
and that's a 4, and then back to a 3. So it was a category 4, Hurricane Esther. Thanks for the clarification on that. But yeah, that was a 4, and then it did its little loop and weakened, and made landfall as a tropical storm. So I'll page through the rest. Any other questions or
Edna, somebody
comments?
said Edna was a longer track hurricane from the central Atlantic, whereas Hurricane Carol was right offshore of the Bahamas. And both got sucked up into New England, which, yeah, like
Yep.
you said,
Yep. Yeah, it doesn't really matter where they originate, but once they get to the Bahamas, it's our business most of the time. So that's where you want to pay attention.
that's it.
All right. Well, Bryce and I want to thank everyone for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this look at the earlier 1900s, especially. I kind of like the 50s and the 60s because we had all the hurricanes and we had some pretty good winter storms too. So those are always kind of fun to look at. And again, next Tuesday we'll be featuring part 4, which will go back to colonial times and look at some events from way, way back that we've kind of dug out from the archives and weather journals and newspapers. So we hope you can join us for that. This will be, again, posted on our YouTube channel if you want to go back and take a look, or at some of the other part 1 or part 2 as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. And Bryce, thank you for going through all the questions and comments. We had a lot of good ones tonight. We thank everyone for joining us. And again, you want to provide feedback, just shoot me an email, or if you have a question you think of later. My email address is on the screen, or you can use your webinar confirmation. We'd love to hear from you. Maybe also, tell us what you like or what don't like, or maybe you think of a topic for a future webinar. We'd love to, keep these going as long as we can. So if you have any ideas for future topics, certainly let us know, and Bryce and I will get to work on it. So with that, thanks again for joining, and have a great evening, and we will see you soon. Take care.